Finland has brought charges against the captain and first and second officers of the Eagle S oil tanker over the cutting of undersea cables in the Gulf of Finland in December. The Georgian and Indian nationals are suspected of aggravated criminal mischief by dragging the ship's anchor for around 56 miles across the seabed. The defendants, who are not permitted to leave Finland, have denied committing the offences and believe Finland lacks jurisdiction in the case, as the incident took place outside Finnish territorial waters. Finnish authorities have said the Cook Islands registered Eagle S broke the Estlink 2 undersea power cable connecting Finland and Estonia, as well as 4 internet lines. Is this a show of force from Finland against Vladimir Putin's hybrid warfare? And what was Russia hoping to achieve targeting a newly joined NATO country? We spoke to a military expert to find out.
We know where you are, you have vulnerabilities, so don't try and confront us. So that is the message they're seeking to send to NATO at the moment. To understand the Eagle S, you have to go back to this notion that we always say that 2's a pattern, 3's a trend, and understand the reactions to the 2 events that took place before the Eagle S dragged its anchor on the 25th of December 2024. Essentially, the Russians in the Baltic Sea have used anchor dragging ghost ships and spy drones, and a campaign began in October 23 when the Baltic Connector gas pipeline between Finland and Estonia lost pressure. That was by a Chinese flagship with Russian ties called the New Polar Bear. That also dragged its anchor. Then on October 2024, the Yingpeng 3 again severed 2 more pipelines or undersea cables by anchor dragging, and the European intelligence said that the crew were bribed by the Russian security services to do that. Now, both of those, of course, were part of the hybrid warfare in terms of plausible deniability, and the Finnish couldn't board that ship because of the complexities of international law, because the incident occurred in international waters. It is that led to this 2's a pattern, 3's a trend, with the Eagle S tanker on the 25th of December, where it took out 5 separate undersea cables in a single run of 56 miles. And it was that which led to the Western patience running out, and Finnish special forces boarded the ship in international waters and forced it into a Finnish port, with the crew being in custody. And it's that background which leads to the Finland now filing criminal charges against the captain and 2 senior officers of the Eagle S for the 60 million euros of damage on that, under the premise of criminal mischief and aggravated interference with communication. It's also worth saying that on the Eagle S there was spy equipment on it for tracking NATO ships and aircraft. So it's the fact that the patience of the West ran out, criminal charges have been laid, and it was also that ship, the Eagle S, which led to the imposition of the NATO Operation Baltic Sentry in January 25, when warships, patrol aircraft and drones now have a continuous surveillance pattern in the Baltic Sea, and it is this which has generally led to ship versus ship confrontations cooling, although the confrontation has gone to other means now. The Russians are using spy drones from their ships in their sort of shadow fleet, or from Russian-linked vessels, to map the vulnerabilities of NATO and Western defences, critical national infrastructure and military bases in that area. I think what will be interesting is to see if the charges stick because of that complexity of the international legislation and the fact that it was done in international waters, vis-a-vis that it was taken into, then escorted into Finnish waters. Now, indeed, we've seen some of that recently, because after the Eagle S, there was a notion that other NATO countries would escort these shadow tankers into their countries and detain them. And indeed, that's what Estonia did in April with a ship called the Koala. Then they attempted to do the same thing later on in April with a tanker called the Jaguar. And it is then that Russia really showed its hand, because it was then that we had the buzzing of the Estonian ship as it was trying to detain the Jaguar with a S-35 jet as a sort of provocation. So there is absolutely no doubt that there is a symmetry here and a direct link between the Russian state, the Russian military, and the Shadow Fleet. Well, the Shadow Fleet is really a bunch of ships which are sort of off the balance sheet, as it were. There is a complexity in where ships are registered and where they're owned, and it's using a sort of subterfuge to try and disguise what their purpose is and the point point of origin. And this is also one of the complexities you see, for example, around the Eagle S, where it's a Cook Island registered ship owned elsewhere, may be operated in a subterfuge by the Russians, but it may be Russian crewed. So there's no doubt that this is a hybrid warfare operation. And not only that, they have been mapping the seabed. We've seen both in the North Sea and across the Irish coast to the Republic there, a research ship of the Russians called the Admiral Vladimir data collecting on wind farms, gas pipelines, power and internet cables. And that will be a theatre of great power competition in the future, not only necessarily with Russia, who have this inconvenient Baltic Lake, because the fact that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO means it essentially can be that. And indeed, one of the options for NATO in the future, should there be a confrontation, would be to blockade Russia out of the Baltic. Now, they're not going to do that at the moment with the Shadow Fleet, because that could be deemed to be an act of war. But again, like all these things, an act of war is a political phrase. It has no real legal meaning and is underpinned really by Article 2 brackets 4 close brackets of the UN Charter, which essentially says that war is expunged from the international lexicon, and you can only go to war under two circumstances. Firstly, when you're underpinned by a UN Security Council resolution, or secondly, under Article 51, a inherent right of self-defence. Neither of those will pertain. I don't think we'll get to that sort of situation. It is possible because essentially Russia have only two ports in the Baltic from which to operate, and you could close the Skagerrak Straits in times of transition to war should NATO deem that to be what they require to do. Be in no doubt that should there be a transition to war, the Western economies are underpinned by an internet connectivity, in particular by 600 active and planned undersea cables. It's very difficult to cut all those at any one time, and the internet of course always finds its way, and that underpins the digital economy. But you can't have a war economy without fossil fuels to power that. So this is why the wind farms, the gas pipelines, the oil pipelines are also relevant. So mapping them is a pre-war activity, and you hope that the amelioration of politics means you're never going to get to the situation where you may have to go to war to fight for those things. Well, NATO has been aware of this since and taking it really seriously from 2023. As I said, they launched Operation Baltic Sentry in January 25, complex mix of warships, patrol aircraft and drones, using satellite communications and constellations in the future with that sort of mapping of the Shadow Fleet. And this is another interesting potential development in the future where, Musk and the commercialization of the potential battle space comes in. So you may see another cluster of Starlink satellites over the Baltic Sea as a aid to finding and tracking this sort of Shadow Fleet. So it's keeping them tracked on a 24-hour basis, which is the key thing. Also, the NATO set up a NATO Centre for Pipeline Protection. That's actually run at the NATO Maritime Centre, which is in the UK. It's at Northwood. There's an international cable protection committee. So there's a lot of things being done, and most of the pipelines are actually built and operated by US or NATO countries. One of the areas where we'll see a change, I think, in the future is that there's a Chinese country called H&M Technologies that's moving to increase its market share. And that is potentially where, again, you'll get this future theatre of great power competition, because one of the prime companies for underwater cables in Asia is Japan. So you could see some confrontation and complexities between Japan and China there. But the notion of the innocent passage and transit passage, which is underpinned by, again, another UN Convention of the Law of the Sea signed in 1982, that complexity will be tested in any future war, I think.